At Thanksgiving, my sister pointed at the folding chair in the corner and said, "That's where you belong. Out of the way." My dad laughed. "Be grateful you're even invited." I looked around. My seat wasn't even set. So I quietly slid the final envelope into the turkey platter and said, "This was the last meal on me." Then I walked out, and the power cut off an hour later. I, 32M, stared at the folding chair tucked away in the corner of my parents' dining room, feeling the familiar knot form in my stomach. My sister gestured toward it with that smug smile she'd perfected over the years, telling me that's where I belonged, out of the way. Dad's laughter echoed through the room as he added that I should be grateful they even invited me. The mahogany table was set for 8 people, complete with the good china and crystal glasses, but my spot wasn't among them. This wasn't new. For the past 5 years, ever since I'd started my own business instead of joining Dad's law firm like my sister had, I'd been relegated to the children's table, the kitchen counter, or worse, completely forgotten. My sister had seamlessly stepped into the role of golden child, while I became the family disappointment who chose a different path. But today was different. Today, I'd come prepared. I walked over to the folding chair without protest, something that seemed to surprise everyone. Mom glanced up from the kitchen, probably expecting the usual argument. My sister's husband whispered something to her that made her smirk. The rest of the extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, continued their conversations, barely acknowledging my presence. As I sat down, I pulled out my phone and opened the email I drafted 3 days ago. My finger hovered over the send button for just a moment before I pressed it. The email went out to 12 recipients, each one carefully selected. Then I quietly stood up and walked over to the kitchen where Mom was putting the finishing touches on the turkey. She asked me to help carry some dishes to the table, treating me like hired help rather than her son. I obliged, but when I reached for the turkey platter, I slid a manila envelope underneath it, positioning it so it would be impossible to miss when someone went to carve the bird. The envelope contained photocopies of documents I'd spent weeks gathering, bank statements, property records, and most importantly, the falsified invoices my sister had been submitting to Dad's firm. She'd been embezzling money for 2 years, funding her lavish lifestyle and her husband's failing restaurant. The envelope also contained a detailed breakdown of how she'd been manipulating the family trust fund, diverting money that was supposed to be distributed equally among all the grandchildren for their college funds. I discovered it all by accident 6 months ago when Dad had asked me to help with some computer issues at his office. A file had been left open on my sister's computer, and what I saw made my blood run cold. She wasn't just the perfect daughter. She was a thief who'd been stealing from her own family while positioning herself as the responsible one. I'd spent months documenting everything, taking photos of documents, tracking transactions, and building an airtight case. I'd even consulted with a forensic accountant friend who confirmed what I suspected. This wasn't just carelessness or poor bookkeeping. This was deliberate, systematic theft. But that wasn't all in the envelope. I'd also included documentation of how my parents had been lying about the family will. For years, they'd told me that the house and the majority of Dad's assets would be split equally between my sister and me. The truth was that they'd changed the will 3 years ago, leaving everything to her except for a token $5,000 for me. I'd only found out when I'd helped Dad organize his files and stumbled across the updated documents. As everyone gathered around the table, I made my announcement. I told them this was the last meal they'd be having on my dime, something that earned confused looks from everyone present. They didn't know that for the past 3 years, I'd been the one paying for these elaborate holiday dinners. When Dad's firm started struggling, he'd quietly asked me for help, claiming it was temporary. I'd been covering the costs of these gatherings, the house maintenance, even some of their monthly bills, all while being treated like a second-class family member. I told them I was done, that they could figure out their own finances from now on. My sister rolled her eyes and made some comment about me being dramatic, as usual. Dad started to say something about family loyalty, but I was already walking toward the door. That's when I pulled out my phone again and sent the second email I'd prepared. This one went to my utility company, my bank, and my financial advisor. Within the hour, every automatic payment I'd set up for my parents' household would be canceled. The electricity, gas, water, internet. All of it had been coming out of my accounts because Dad had claimed his credit was temporarily damaged from some business issues. I walked to my car as the first course was being served, knowing that in about 30 minutes, someone would move the turkey platter and discover the envelope. I drove to a coffee shop about 10 minutes away and waited. The first call came 47 minutes later. It was Mom, her voice shaking as she asked me what the documents in the envelope meant. I explained everything calmly. How my sister had been stealing, how they'd cut me out of the will while still expecting my financial support, how I'd been funding their lifestyle while being treated like garbage. She tried to interrupt, tried to explain, but I told her I was done listening to excuses. I'd given them chance after chance to treat me with basic respect, and they'd chosen to take advantage of my generosity instead. The second call came 20 minutes later from Dad, his voice tight with anger. He demanded that I come back and explain myself, accused me of trying to destroy the family over petty jealousies. I reminded him that I had copies of everything and that if they wanted to dispute any of it, they were welcome to take it to court. I also mentioned that I'd already spoken with an attorney about the embezzlement and that my sister might want to start thinking about restitution. The third call was from my sister herself, screaming about how I was making everything up, how I was jealous of her success. Her tune changed quickly when I started reading off specific transaction amounts and dates. The line went quiet when I mentioned the forensic accountant who'd helped me trace the money trail. As I sat in that coffee shop, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time since I'd started my business, since I'd chosen my own path instead of the one they'd laid out for me, I wasn't carrying the weight of their expectations and disappointments. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin asking what was happening and why everyone was arguing. I realized that the extended family was probably getting caught in the crossfire, so I sent a group message to the relatives I actually cared about, briefly explaining that I discovered some financial irregularities and family issues that needed to be addressed. I told them this wasn't about them and that I hoped we could maintain our relationships despite whatever drama was about to unfold. Update 1. The power cut off exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes after I'd left, just as I calculated it would. My phone started buzzing immediately with panicked calls and texts. Apparently, they'd been in the middle of cooking the dessert when everything went dark. Mom called first, her voice frantic as she explained that the electricity had suddenly stopped working. I calmly reminded her that the electric bill had been coming out of my account for the past 2 years, and as of that morning, I'd canceled all automatic payments. She asked how they were supposed to finish cooking Thanksgiving dinner, and I suggested she call the utility company to set up service in their own name. Dad called next, angrier than I'd ever heard him. He accused me of sabotaging Thanksgiving, of being vindictive and cruel. I pointed out that expecting someone else to pay your bills while treating them like garbage was considerably more cruel. He demanded that I restore the power immediately, and I told him that wasn't how utility companies worked. They'd need to call and set up their own account. What they didn't realize was that this was just the beginning. The gas would be shut off the next day, followed by the water service on Friday. I'd been covering utilities for their house, their office building, and even my sister's condo that she'd claimed was temporarily in my name for credit purposes. All of it was about to come to a halt. My sister called around 9 that evening, her voice completely different from earlier. Gone was the arrogant tone, replaced by something closer to desperation. She asked if we could talk, if there was a way to work this out. I told her that the time for talking had passed when she chose to steal from the family while making me feel like an outsider. She tried to minimize it, claiming it was just borrowing, that she'd always intended to pay it back. I asked her about the vacation to Europe last month, the new car, the renovations to her condo, all funded with stolen money while I ate ramen noodles to afford covering everyone else's bills. She went quiet. The really beautiful part was watching it all unfold on social media. My cousin posted a confused status about Thanksgiving ending early due to power issues. My aunt shared a cryptic message about family drama. My sister's husband posted a frustrated rant about electrical problems ruining the holiday, not knowing his wife was about to be exposed as a thief. But the best part came the next morning. Update 2. Friday morning brought the revelation I'd been waiting for. Dad called at 6 a.m., his voice hoarse and defeated. He'd spent the night going through financial records, trying to understand the extent of what my sister had done. The reality was worse than even I had initially discovered. She hadn't just been embezzling from the law firm. She'd been forging Dad's signature on business loan applications, using the firm as collateral for personal debts. The restaurant her husband had been running wasn't just failing. It was hemorrhaging money that she'd been funneling from Dad's accounts to keep it afloat. The total amount was close to $400,000. Dad asked if I would consider coming over to talk, his voice breaking as he admitted that he was scared they might lose everything. For a moment, I felt the old familiar pull to rush over and fix things, to be the reliable son who solved everyone's problems. Then I remembered the folding chair in the corner, and my resolve hardened. I told him I'd consider meeting with them, but only under specific conditions. First, they needed to acknowledge in writing everything they'd done, the financial manipulation, the lies about the will, the years of treating me like a second-class family member. Second, my sister needed to confess to the embezzlement and begin making restitution. Third, they needed to make things right with the extended family who'd been affected by the lies. He agreed immediately, which told me how desperate things had gotten. The meeting happened that afternoon at a neutral location, a conference room I rented at a nearby business center. Dad looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Mom kept dabbing at her eyes with tissues. My sister sat rigidly in her chair, her usual confidence completely gone. Dad started by admitting that they'd been wrong to treat me the way they had. He acknowledged that I'd been financially supporting them while they'd excluded me from family decisions and celebrations. He apologized for the will situation, claiming they'd been influenced by my sister's arguments that she was more responsible and better suited to handle the inheritance. My sister's apology was harder to extract. She tried to justify her actions, claiming she'd been under pressure to maintain appearances, that the restaurant was supposed to be a surprise investment that would pay everyone back. I cut through her excuses by laying out the timeline of her spending alongside her claims of financial hardship. The evidence was impossible to argue with. Mom's confession was the most painful to hear. She admitted that they'd always expected me to be the one who took care of everyone else, that they'd taken my generosity for granted. She said they'd somehow convinced themselves that because I was successful in business, I didn't need the same emotional support and inclusion that my sister required. The conversation lasted 3 hours, and by the end, we had a written agreement. My sister would begin paying back the stolen money at $2,000 per month, plus interest. Dad would revise the will to split everything equally, as originally promised. They would also send written apologies to the extended family members who'd been caught up in the lies about my absence from family events. Most importantly, they agreed that future family gatherings would include me as an equal participant, not as hired help or an afterthought. No more folding chairs in corners, no more exclusion from family decisions, no more taking my financial support for granted while treating me like garbage. But I wasn't done yet. Update 3. The real test came 2 weeks later at my cousin's birthday party. I arrived to find that my parents had actually followed through on part of their agreement. They'd sent apologies to the extended family and explained the real reasons behind years of awkward family dynamics. My aunt pulled me aside early in the evening to tell me she'd always wondered why I seemed to miss so many family events. She'd been told I was too busy with work or that I'd chosen not to come, never knowing that I'd often been deliberately excluded or made to feel unwelcome. Several other relatives shared similar stories, and I realized how extensively my parents had been managing the narrative around my absence. The biggest surprise was my sister's behavior. She approached me hesitantly, asking if we could talk privately. We stepped out onto the back porch, and for the first time in years, she seemed genuinely remorseful. She told me she'd started seeing a therapist to address what she called her entitlement issues. She admitted that she'd always resented my business success because it made her feel like Dad loved her less, even though his attention and approval had always come easier to her. The stealing had started small, she said, but had snowballed as she tried to maintain a lifestyle that would prove she was just as successful as I was. What struck me most was her admission that she'd actively encouraged our parents to exclude me from family events. She'd convinced them that I was too proud to accept charity but too unreliable to be counted on for important family moments. She'd painted me as selfish and disconnected, while positioning herself as the devoted daughter who'd never leave their side. She asked what she could do to make things right between us, beyond just paying back the money. I told her the truth, that trust, once broken this badly, couldn't be quickly repaired. But I was willing to see if she was serious about changing, if her actions matched her words over time. The evening ended with something I hadn't experienced in years, sitting at the main table with my family, being included in conversations about future plans, being treated like my opinions mattered. It felt strange after so long, but also reminded me of what I'd been fighting for all along. 3 months later, my sister had made her first 2 payments toward restitution and had started working with Dad's attorney to unwind the fraudulent loan documents. Dad's business was slowly recovering, though he'd had to take out a legitimate loan to cover some of the immediate debts my sister's actions had created. More importantly, the family dynamics had shifted. I was no longer the automatic solution to everyone's financial problems, but I was also no longer treated like the family disappointment. When they needed help, they asked respectfully and offered fair compensation. When they planned gatherings, I was included from the beginning, not added as an afterthought. The whole experience taught me something valuable about boundaries and self-respect. For years, I'd enabled their treatment of me by continuing to provide financial support while accepting emotional scraps in return. I told myself that family meant enduring anything, that love meant giving without expecting anything back. But that Thanksgiving dinner changed everything. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to stop enabling their worst behaviors. Sometimes walking away from the table, literally and figuratively, is the only way to demand the respect you deserve. The folding chair is still in my parents' dining room corner, but it's no longer my designated seat. These days, when I visit for dinner, I sit at the table with everyone else, and my place is set before I arrive. It's a small thing, but it represents something much larger, the understanding that I'm not grateful to be included in my own family. I belong here, and I won't accept anything less than being treated that way. That envelope I slid under the turkey platter contained more than evidence of financial crimes. It contained my declaration that I was done accepting less than I deserved. The power cutting off an hour later was just the exclamation point on a message I should have delivered years earlier. Some people might say I went too far, that family should forgive and forget. But I learned that real family doesn't ask you to forget. They work to ensure there's nothing to forgive in the first place. They don't make you choose between your dignity and their acceptance. They don't put you in a corner and tell you to be grateful for the privilege.